right, Derek, here we go. I'm adding it to the screen, and you are there. It looks great.
All right. Did Jesus rise from the dead? The failure of resurrection apologetics by yours truly. All right. So I just popped into the next screen. Are you following?
I am. I'm muting just so there's
Okay.
no audio issue.
Okay. So we're going to begin with the principle of analogy. We can only assess the prior probability of a historical occurrence for which we were not present by way of comparison to analogous data. So this is just a fancier way of saying, what does it look like? We weren't there, we don't know, but when we look at data, from the present day all the way down through history, what does it most resemble? We have no real world analogy to fully deceased persons physically arising from death. None, at least that we can verify. Our contemporary experience of the world, along with biological science, tells us that this is vastly improbable, if not impossible. The closest analogy we do have is of the mythic and legendary variety, such as the bodily resurrections of other ancient divinities like Osiris, Baal, Inanna, as well as Aristeas and Asclepius. Check out my past presentation, Resurrection and Apotheosis in Pre-Christian Antiquity, to get up to speed on all of that information. Like Christ, the resurrections of these figures were accompanied variously by exaltation, enthronement, missing body motifs, and or post-mortem appearances to others. All were hence immortal, never to die again. By way of analogy, the death and resurrection of Christ has all the appearance of an ancient legend with no correspondence to real-world data. Per the old adage, if it acts like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. Simple enough. Posterior probability. Christian apologists argue that a special case can be made for the resurrection of Christ based on overriding evidence. This is the posterior probability, the likelihood of a historical occurrence, despite all appearances, despite prior probability, after the evidence has been taken into account. The nearly insurmountable issue for apologists is that for something as vastly improbable as the resurrection, which has no correspondence to real-world events, the evidence would have to be extraordinarily compelling. This is why we say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That said, let us examine the evidence. Is it sufficiently compelling enough to conclude that in this one instance, a sacred figure really was raised from the dead to immortal life? So starting with persecution and martyrdom, apologists argue that the willingness of the disciples to undergo persecution and even death speaks to the truth of the resurrection. Unlike the 9/11 hijackers or Islamic suicide bombers, these individuals were in a position to know whether or not Christ had truly been raised. Their proximity to the events means that they must have yielded their lives for the sake of what they knew was true. After all, who would die for a lie? Objection number one, there is a major distinction to be made between lying and being sincerely mistaken. I agree that early Christians sincerely believed that Christ had been raised. I don't think anyone was lying, and I don't think most skeptics think that. Objection two, the earliest Christians believed that Christ had been exalted to heaven upon his resurrection, rather than resuming his earthly life in contemporary Judea. See A.W. Zweep, The Ascension of the Messiah in Luke and Christology on this point. Also see my previous presentation, Resurrection and Apotheosis in Pre-Christian Antiquity, where I do more of a deep dive into this as well. So they didn't have this idea that you find in the Gospels that Jesus is hanging out in Judea for a day, 40 days, however long. It was that he had been exalted up to heaven to be at the right hand of God. How could their faith in such a thing be proven false? How is anyone going to say, hey, you know this didn't happen. You know Jesus wasn't really around to speak with and eat fish with and all this. No, they believed he was up in heaven. How exactly were you going to falsify that? Of course, you could bring up the empty tomb and the exhuming of the body, but we will certainly get to that. Objection number 3, fervent believers have, in fact, yielded their lives for demonstrably false beliefs, even when they were in a position to know better. Marshall Applewhite of the Heaven's Gate UFO cult not only took his own life, believing his own self-deception about a spaceship trailing the comet Hale-Bopp, but convinced 38 others to do the same. More recently, the January 6th Capitol rioter Ashley Babbitt died fighting for the demonstrably false belief that the 2020 election was rigged against former President Donald Trump. People die for sincerely held beliefs, even when they could have known better had they just listened. We have no data prior to Pliny the Younger's letter to Emperor Trajan around 112 CE that early Christians were actually made to recant their faith on pain of death. The stoning of Stephen in Acts 7 concerns a later convert, not a disciple or witness. James, son of Zebedee, is killed by Herod in Acts 12, but we're never told whether he had a chance to recant, what the circumstances of his death were. First Clement, around 95 CE, if even that early, vaguely says that Peter and Paul witnessed unto death, though we are not told of the circumstances of their deaths, whether they had a chance to recant or whether recanting would have been relevant. Convincing arguments have been made that First Clement concerns the jealousy and envy of fellow Christians, an internal strife that disturbed the peace and led to intervention from Roman authorities. See David L. Eastman's Jealousy, Internal Strife, and the Deaths of Peter and Paul, a reassessment of First Clement in the Journal of Ancient Christianity, very convincingly argued. Who else is going to be jealous or envious but fellow Christians? So this would not have been a matter of the Roman authorities saying, hey, I need you to recant your belief. No, they would have said, hey, I need you to stop causing a ruckus or we're killing you. The closest thing we have from a secular historian is Josephus's account of the death of James, whereby the high priest Ananus, a bold man in his temper and very insolent, saw an opportunity to flex his political muscle by bringing James and some others before the Sanhedrin, forming an accusation against them as breakers of the law, and having them stoned to death. Many were upset by this, resulting in King Agrippa stripping Ananus of the high priesthood. So, breakers of the law, if you know anything about ancient Judaism, in terms of the Mosaic law, it was not a monolith. Different Jews had different interpretations of the law and how it should be practiced. So this appears to be a matter of you're not practicing the law in the way that I would prefer as a Sadducee, which is what Ananus was. So he had him killed for that. There's just nothing here explicitly speaking of the resurrection. And then King Agrippa strips Ananus of the high priesthood for having done what he did. How likely is that if James and company were preaching Jesus as the risen Messiah who would conquer Rome and so forth? Please, it's just not about that. There's nothing in the text that would recommend that. Later second century accounts concerning the deaths of Peter, Paul, and John are so legendary and fictitious that they cannot be deemed reliable. They include stories of talking animals, resurrected fish, the resurrection of Paul, and John surviving being boiled alive. They're just fiction, and they can't be taken at their word. Fervent belief in the face of persecution is a common theme in other faith traditions. Sumaya bint Kabat was a female companion of Muhammad and an early martyr for Islam. The Quraysh persecuted Muslims of low social rank. Members of the Makhzum clan tortured Sumaya's family to pressure them to abandon their faith. On one occasion, she was put inside a pitcher full of water and lifted so that she could not escape. She, Yasir, and Ammar were all forced to stand in the sun in the heat of the day dressed in male coats. Although described as a very old and frail woman, Sumaya remained steadfast and refused to abandon Islam. A member of the Makhzum clan later killed her by stabbing and impaling her with his spear. You know, she would not abandon her faith even in the face of persecution and death, doesn't speak to the truth of Islam. Anti-Mormonism was so severe that early Mormons were forced to flee west to Salt Lake Valley in Utah. In 1838, the Missouri governor declared the Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state. Shortly thereafter, a militia attacked a Mormon settlement at Haun's Mill, which resulted in the death of 18 Mormons. The religion endured, it carried on, didn't matter. Threats of death and persecution, the religion perseveres nonetheless. An 1838 pamphlet titled Antidote to Mormonism described Mormons as miserable enemies of both God and man, engines of death and hell. My point being that often you'll see apologists say, well, but they face so much persecution. Well, even if they did, it doesn't speak to that. I mean, they certainly sincerely held these beliefs, but it doesn't have any bearing on whether or not those beliefs were true. Getting into the empty tomb, a tomb found empty. Critics point out that the empty tomb narrative is not definitively introduced until the Gospel of Mark, some 40 years after the death of Jesus, and the subsequent Gospel accounts are all dependent upon Mark. In answer to this, apologists cite 1 Corinthians 15, which contains an early creedal statement that Christ was buried. That's it, was buried. It cannot be known whether this entailed a tomb or a trench grave. If we follow Dale Allison in granting that by burial, Paul meant an honorable burial, let's just grant that. Let's say it was indeed an honorable burial. Still, the majority of the Jewish non-elite population in early Roman Palestine was buried in trench or cist graves. Unlike rock-cut tombs, trench graves did not impose an obvious mark on the ancient landscape or the archaeological record. It is for this reason that the simple trench graves at Qumran have been called Essene, sectarian, heterodox, and deviant, as have trench graves discovered elsewhere. These graves, however, likely represent the common burial practice of those near and below subsistence level, which we know Jesus probably was. That's per Anthony Ketty, the Vitae Prophetarum, and the Archaeology of Jewish Burials, Exploring Class Distinctions in Early Roman Palestine in the Journal of Ancient Judaism. It is certainly possible that Jesus was buried in a tomb, but the mere possibility does not make it probable. To argue as such is a possibility fallacy. If whoever drafted the creed did have in mind burial in a tomb, then logically that would entail their having thought that Jesus' body was no longer in the tomb since he'd been taken up to heaven. But that still doesn't equate to the gospel narratives whereby the tomb was actually found, discovered empty. So even if you wanted to argue that Paul had in mind a tomb and that the tomb had been left empty, that doesn't get you to the narratives we have in the Gospels where the tomb is actually discovered empty. That's equivocation. Apologists argue that had the resurrected body of Jesus not actually left a tomb vacant, Jewish or Roman authorities would have produced his corpse in order to quell the movement. According to Acts 2, however, the apostles did not begin preaching the resurrection until 7 weeks after his death at Pentecost, about 50 days later. By then, no recognizable corpse of Jesus could be produced. Within 3 weeks, you've got advanced decay, and by around the 50-day mark, at 50 plus days, you're into skeletonization. If we take Acts by its word, and I don't, but it pretty well tracks. I mean, who was going to take it upon themselves to actually exhume the corpse to begin with? But if they had, it wouldn't have been until sometime after they were preaching this. So, I'd say Acts 2 pretty well tracks with how much time would have elapsed by the time anyone would have been concerned with what these people were preaching. And, at 50 days or over, there's not going to be anything to produce that's going to be remotely identifiable as Jesus. Apologists appeal also to Jewish polemics concerning the empty tomb as verification of their knowledge that the tomb was actually found empty. According to Matthew 28 and Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, Jews charged that the disciples had simply stolen the body. Assuming that such polemics are actually historical rather than fictitious, this cannot be taken as firsthand knowledge of an empty tomb by Jews in the late 1st or mid-2nd century. If the precise location of Jesus' grave cannot be determined, and that may well be if it was in an unmarked cist grave, or if the body of Jesus could not be identified by the time Christian preaching reached Jerusalem, which it could not have, there would have been no alternative for Jewish polemicists than to concede the possibility of the bare fact of the grave's emptiness, and then go on to point out that in any event, the emptiness of the grave, even if it could be demonstrated, would not prove anything more than that the body had been stolen or deliberately removed by the followers of Jesus themselves. So this does not prove that Jews conceded that they knew for a fact that there was an empty tomb. It's just a tit for tat. It's rhetoric. The empty tomb narrative represents a common motif in the Hellenistic world from which Christianity sprang. That is, the apotheosis tales of other divine men that thickly foliated the region. Romulus, when he vanished, left neither the least part of his body nor any remnant of his clothes to be seen. The senators suffered them not to search or busy themselves about the matter, but commanded them to honor and worship Romulus as one taken up to the gods. And immediately lightning fell from the heavens, and the pier was wholly consumed. After this, when the companions of Iolaus came to gather up the bones of Heracles and found not a single bone anywhere, they assumed that in accordance with the words of the oracle, he had passed from among men into the company of the gods. Aristaeus went into a fuller's shop at Proconnesus and there died. The owner shut his shop and went away to tell the dead man's relatives, and the report of Aristaeus' death being spread about in the city was disputed by a man of Cyzicus, who said that he had met Aristaeus going toward Cyzicus and spoken with him. While he argued vehemently, the relatives of the dead man came to the fuller's shop with all that was necessary for burial, but when the place was opened, there was no Aristaeus there, dead or alive. There are many, many, many examples of this trope in the Hellenistic world, well before, during, and after the time of Christianity. Probably not a coincidence. Dr. Richard Miller proposes that the final chapters of Mark, chapters 15 through 16, including the empty tomb narrative, place the tradition squarely within that of Romulus. He lists the following 5 mimetic signals. Those include the missing body, of course, prodigies, signs, and wonders, darkness over the land, being declared Son of God, and the people fleeing. That's from Mark's Empty Tomb and Other Translation Fables in Classical Antiquity in the Journal of Biblical Literature. I highly recommend reading that work. And he also does a comparison. This is just a small sampling. He does a comparison of the Romulus tale and the motifs and tropes associated with it with all 3 of the Synoptic Gospels, and the sheer preponderance of parallels is just overwhelming. I tend to think that early Christians, the gospel writers, were probably quite familiar with these apotheosis traditions. Thus, it's no surprise to find a missing body motif in these gospels. Too early for myth. Apologists argue that there simply had not been enough time for mythic and legendary embellishment in the interim between Jesus' death and the writing of the New Testament accounts, or we could say when Christians began to believe. For frame of reference, the Gospels were written toward the end of the 1st century, beginning with Mark around 70 CE, some 40 years after the death of Jesus. The other Gospels are, of course, later. The epistles of Paul were written in the 50 CE, some 20 years after the death of Jesus. Of course, Paul's letters contain early Christian creeds that attest to belief in the resurrection sometime prior to his writing, though we don't know when or where they come from, what their dating is. Firstly, myths can and do develop rapidly within zealous religious movements. Gershom Scholem speaks of the fast-spreading legends and the sudden and almost explosive surge of miracle stories concerning the 17th century messianic figure Sabbatai Sevi within his own lifetime, sometimes even weeks or days after he made public appearances. He says the sway of imagination was so strongly in evidence in the letters sent to Egypt and elsewhere, which by the autumn of 1665 had assumed the character of regular messianic propaganda in which fiction far outweighed the facts. The prophet was encompassed with a fiery cloud, and the voice of an angel was heard from the cloud. At the prophet's command, great stones had fallen from heaven on the house of worship of the Gentiles. There are other such tales in these letters too, such as him killing a highwayman with his very words, escaping locked chains magically. I mean, just a whole swarm of these tales that arose very early, very rapidly within a movement where you had this kind of religious apocalyptic fervor. Secondly, the notion that myths and legends cannot endure during the lifetimes of those who could dispute them is utterly false. Despite the military issuing statements that the object which crashed in Roswell, New Mexico was a surveillance balloon, both after the initial event in 1947 and again in 1994, many continue to promulgate conspiracy theories about a UFO cover-up at Roswell. And if you look at the image here, there is your flying saucer. There's your extraterrestrial technology. It's a weather balloon. Forget it. False reports about widespread fraud and rigged voting machines in the 2020 presidential election have endured among Donald Trump fanatics, despite their being debunked by major news media outlets everywhere and Donald Trump's own Attorney General, William Barr. Nothing more ironic than that Donald Trump was supposed to be evangelical Christianity's main man, and yet no one has done more than Donald Trump to expose the fallacies of apologetics. We've gotten a good close look at just how irrational people can be, the kind of sincere beliefs they can hold, even when they're just utterly demonstrably false. Thirdly, Christianity arose during a period of apocalyptic fervor, not unlike that of Sabbatai Sevi, in which the kingdom of God and resurrection of the dead were imminently expected. Given these expectations, as well as numerous passages in the Hebrew scriptures which speak of redemption and exaltation, we should not be surprised that belief in the resurrection and exaltation of Christ developed rapidly. Early Christians were primed by their culture and religious expectations for just such a belief. If you ask me, I say yes, belief in the resurrection probably did arise quite early and for reasons that we would naturally expect. The 1 Corinthians 15 appearances. As noted earlier, 1 Corinthians 15 contains an early Christian creed that lists all those to whom the risen Jesus appeared, including Peter, the disciples, a group of 500 brothers all at once, then James, all the other apostles, and finally Paul himself. New Testament scholarship cogently demonstrates that these are theophanies, that is, appearances of the already exalted Christ who now dwells in heaven, not a revivified corpse who lives among the disciples in Judea, as in the later Gospels, as I mentioned earlier. So the chronology of the earliest resurrection belief is expressed as resurrection, exaltation, and then appearances from heaven. These are divine theophanies. Doesn't mean they didn't sincerely believe that they might have seen something, but that's what they are. This view is shared by various New Testament scholars, including Bart Ehrman, James Tabor, and M. David Litwa, just to list a few. Apologists argue that Paul must have received this creed from Peter and James during his visit to Jerusalem just 3 years after his conversion, as in Galatians 1, but this is sheer surmise, as Paul does not tell us where, when, or from whom he received the creed. Moreover, the creed is written in Greek, not Aramaic. These are not coming from the hands of the earliest disciples in Jerusalem. Paul remains our only first-hand witness to an appearance of the risen and exalted Jesus, which was a vision. Though he knew Peter and James, he was not an eyewitness to any purported events days after the crucifixion, and we have no independent attestation from any of the other 500 plus alleged witnesses, including Peter or James. Just as the missing body motif was common in the Hellenistic world, so too were post-mortem or post-mortal appearances to witnesses. Romulus, after being immortalized and translated to heaven, appeared to Proculus Julius and delivered a great commission for Rome. Asclepius, who was immortalized after death, appeared to Greeks and barbarians alike, including Maximus of Tyre, who wrote a first-hand account, and Antiochus of Agae. Why should we believe Paul any more than we believe Maximus of Tyre? Aristaeus, after having died in a fuller's shop, appeared alive again to a man on the road to Cyzicus, as well as to many abroad. There was a man of praetorian rank who swore an oath that he had seen the form of Caesar Augustus ascending to heaven. These myths are popular in the very time, the very day and age when Christianity is emerging. Probably not a coincidence. Why credit one and not the other? Even if early Christians did believe that the risen Jesus had appeared to them, so too did early Mormons believe that the angel Moroni appeared to them. In fact, we have far better evidence for the appearances of Moroni, including multiple first-hand eyewitness accounts. It was a clear, open, beautiful day, far from any inhabitants, in a remote field, at the time we saw the record, of which it has been spoken, brought and laid before us by an angel, arrayed in glorious light, ascend out of the midst of heaven. Now, if this is human juggling, judge ye. From Eyewitness, Oliver Cowdery. Just as sure as you see the sun shining, just as sure am I that I stood in the presence of an angel of God who saw him hold the gold plates in his hands. From Martin Harris. Gentlemen, do you see that? Are you sure you see it? Are your eyes playing a trick or something? No. Well, as sure as you see my hand, so sure did I see the angel and the plates. Again, from Martin Harris. The early Mormon accounts continued, I saw the Nephite artifacts just as plain as I see this bed, striking his hand upon the bed beside him. And I heard the voice of the Lord as distinctly as I ever heard anything in my life. From David Whitmer. I was not under any hallucination, nor was I deceived. I saw with these eyes, and I heard with these ears. Again, from David Whitmer. Despite these witnesses breaking away from Joseph Smith, they stuck to their testimony until their dying day. Martin Harris later conceded that he only saw the angel in the plates in a visionary or entranced state, though this may also have been the case for early Christians, including Paul. Just read 2 Corinthians 12. He speaks of this being visions and revelations. Other early witnesses to the angel Moroni include Mary Whitmer, Hiram Smith, Luke Johnson, Zara Pulsifer, W. Phelps, John P. Green and his wife Rhoda, John Taylor, Harrison Burgess, Heber C. Kimball, and Oliver Granger. Whatever one makes of these purported appearances of the angel Moroni, the fact remains that they are far better evidenced than the appearances of the risen Jesus. We have multiple first-hand eyewitness accounts and nearly a dozen people who corroborated their experience with similar visions. Far better evidence for the appearances of the angel Moroni than for Jesus. And it still is incredible. Critical New Testament scholarship has long recognized that the Gospels are anonymous works written primarily in third-person narrative form without ever identifying themselves as Mark, Matthew, Luke, or John. This concerns eyewitness testimony. All four of the canonical Gospels were originally anonymous. It was only in the 2nd century CE, when the four Gospels were published as a collection, that the superscriptions were added to the Gospels, attributing authorship to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, respectively. This is also the time that traditions begin to appear about the authors, claiming that they were either original apostles of Jesus or close acquaintances of other well-known apostles. In spite of these attributions, most scholars do not think any of these men were the original gospel writers. None of the Gospels is written in a style that suggests the authors were present at the event being narrated. I'm going to repeat that. None of the Gospels is written in a style that suggests the authors were present at the events being narrated. Just read the Gospels for yourself. Nor is it likely that the disciples of Jesus were able to write in Greek, the language in which the Gospels were written. So we are left with the reality that the Gospels were written by anonymous Christians decades after the events that they relate. From David M. Carr and Colleen M. Conway, An Introduction to the Bible, Sacred Texts, and Imperial Contexts. Apologists appeal to early church fathers such as Papias and Irenaeus, who claimed that Mark was written by an interpreter of Peter and Luke by a companion of Paul, while Matthew compiled the Lord's sayings in the original Aramaic. Internal evidence for these traditional claims of gospel authorship is simply non existent. Mark gives no hint of receiving his information from Peter, nor does Luke do so with Paul. Matthew does contain Semitic idioms, but was nevertheless written in Greek, as are all the others, and relies heavily on material from Mark, which would hardly have been necessary if written by an eyewitness with his own recollection of the events. In answer to this, an answer to Matthew's reliance upon Mark, apologists argue that although an eyewitness, Matthew valued Peter's testimony as provided by Mark. This makes little sense given that Matthew regarded Mark as in need of constant correction. If he valued Mark's gospel so much because this is Peter's testimony, why is he constantly fixing and correcting him? Do see Robert and Price, The Case for Christ, pages 22 through 24, where he just absolutely annihilates this particular defense. Both Papias and Irenaeus were prone to fanciful claims, such as Papias's description of Judas Iscariot swelling to the size of a chariot and oozing live worms, or Irenaeus's suggestion that Jesus lived to nearly 50 years of age. These guys were not beyond fudging things or passing on total nonsense. Therefore, we just cannot look to them as actual reliable sources. The evangelists are omniscient third-person storytellers, as evidenced from the fact that they report what transpired in the wilderness while Jesus was alone for 40 days, as well as the words he prayed while away from the sleeping disciples in Gethsemane. If this were an eyewitness writing, he'd be like, I was there, but he had stepped away to pray all by himself, and I really couldn't tell you what words he prayed. No, the author knows this because he's the omniscient storyteller who's narrating the story, not an eyewitness, a storyteller crafting the narrative. Professor of New Testament and early Christianity Robin Walsh cogently argues that the synoptic gospels were written by elite cultural producers working within a dynamic cadre of literate specialists, including persons who may or may not have been professed Christians. Comparing a range of ancient literature, her groundbreaking study demonstrates that the Gospels are creative works produced by educated elites. That's from the publisher's description of her book, The Origins of Early Christian Literature. I highly suggest watching her interview on the Mythvision podcast with Derek. It's a total game changer, a total paradigm shift, and it makes absolute and total sense given just the sheer the number of Hellenistic Greco-Roman motifs that we find present in the Gospels. They're familiar with the works of Homer, as Dennis McDonald points out, Ovid, Livy. They've got to be, and that's why you see these tropes. They are Greco-Roman. Even if they are Jewish, they're very Hellenized Jews, part of the educated elite. There are a couple of instances in which the Gospels, though not written by eyewitnesses, claim to rely on eyewitness testimony. The introduction to Luke's Gospel, in which the stories of Jesus were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, and the 21st chapter of John's Gospel, in which it is the disciple whom Jesus loved who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. Such literary devices were common to Greek historians and biographers of the time, even when writing highly embellished or fictional accounts. So, as an example, reading chapter 1, beginning of Luke, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Special note, Luke Acts is probably 2nd century, as cogently argued by several scholars, including Josephine expert Steve Mason. The coincidence of aim, themes, and vocabulary seems to suggest that Luke Acts is building its case on the foundation of Josephus's defense of Judaism. Check out Josephus in the New Testament. I'm not going to do a deep dive for you here as far as that goes, but do check out Steve Mason's presentations on the Mythvision podcast with Derek. Other scholars argue this as well, and it's entirely convincing given the kind of strange coincidences between Josephus and Luke Acts. So, in comparison with Luke's introduction, this is from the letter of Aristeas. This is a Jew writing about the translation of the Hebrew Bible into the Greek Septuagint in Alexandria, Egypt. He's writing about his experience investigating this. Since I have collected material for a memorable history of my visit to Eleazar, the high priest of the Jews, and because you, Philocrates, as you lose no opportunity of reminding me, have set great store upon receiving an account of the motives and object of my mission, I have attempted to draw up a clear exposition of the matter for you. It was my devotion to the pursuit of religious knowledge that led me to undertake the embassy to the man I have mentioned, who was held in the highest esteem by his own citizens and by others both for his virtue and his majesty, and who had in his possession documents of the highest value to the Jews in his own country and in foreign lands for the interpretation of the divine law. On a former occasion, too, I sent you a record of the facts which I thought worth relating about the Jewish race, the record which I had obtained from the most learned high priests of the most learned land of Egypt. As you are so eager to acquire the knowledge of those things which can benefit the mind, I feel it incumbent upon me to impart to you all the information in my power. So Aristeas is writing as an eyewitness who's investigating these things, talking to people on the scene in Alexandria. Historians agree that this account is entirely fictional. He's trying to impress you with all the verisimilitude as Luke is, but it's still an entirely fictional account. Philostratus, Life of Apollonius. It seems to me that then that I ought not to condone or acquiesce in the general ignorance, but write a true account of the man, detailing the exact times at which he said or did this or that, as also the habits and temper of wisdom by means of which he succeeded in being considered a supernatural and divine being. And I have gathered my information partly from the many cities where he was loved, and partly from the temples whose long neglected and decayed rites he restored, and partly from the accounts left of him by others, and partly from his own letters. For he addressed these to kings, sophists, philosophers, to men of Elis, of Delphi, to Indians and Ethiopians. And in his letters, he dealt with the subjects of the gods, of customs, of moral principles, of laws, and in all these departments, he corrected the errors into which men had fallen. But the more precise details which I have collected are as follows. So Philostratus is writing up a true, detailed account from talking to people in the cities where he was known. Nevertheless, gives us a highly fictitious and embellished account of the man Philostratus, containing many of the same mythic motifs as we find in the Gospels. Healing the sick, raising the dead, miraculous conception, ascending to heaven, all the same stuff. So this is why, despite Luke's attempt at verisimilitude, we're not buying it. The women as witness. Apologists argue that the testimony of women was so distrusted in the ancient world that nobody would invent such a story as female witnesses to the empty tomb. By the criterion of embarrassment, the story must be true. They were just stuck with the blunt fact of the women having discovered the tomb, the argument goes. This gravely misunderstands the genre of the Gospels. They are Greco-Roman prose biographies, not Palestinian legal documents. This is not taking place in a court setting. That's not what they are. Women were commonly associated with burial and mourning procedures. Ezekiel 8:14 attests to women mourning the slain Tammuz at the gates of the Jerusalem temple. Jeremiah 9:17 through 20 speaks of women mourning for Israel in the time of the Babylonian conquest. In rabbinic times, funeral processions were led by lamenting female mourners, often professionals. Women also composed elegies that were chanted aloud, as evidenced by the Talmud's inclusion of 8 elegies attributed to the women of Shokin Zeb in Babylon. Prohibitions against women's voices being heard in public were relaxed for funerary rituals. That's from Death and Bereavement in Judaism, Ancient Burial Practices from the Encyclopedia Judaica. Women played a big role in this. Now, men were involved in burial and funeral duties as well, as apologists are keen to point out, but it was such a common role among women that its portrayal in the Gospels is unsurprising. We would expect this to be there from a narrator. They're not Palestinian legal documents. This is not a court setting. Now we're going to get into N.T. Wright's argument for the resurrection, which is unique, anachronistic anastasis. Apologist N.T. Wright has popularized the argument from anachronistic anastasis, suggesting that the resurrection of a single individual ahead of the general resurrection in Judaism is so unprecedented that no ancient Jew could have conceived of it unless it were simply true. This presupposes that ideas are static and unchanging, not susceptible to modification, which is obviously false. The very idea of resurrection in the Hebrew Bible morphs from metaphorical expressions of the restoration of Israel to literal resurrection of the dead by the time we get to Daniel. Ideas are subject to change, and ancient Jews were no exception. Mark 6:14 to 16 tells of Herod proclaiming that Jesus was John the Baptist raised from the dead. Evidently, resurrection ahead of the end times was conceivable to some Jews, even if in this case it was not to a mortal life. So it's clear John the Baptist, he didn't live again forever, but there's still an idea of resurrection ahead of the general resurrection of the dead. How difficult could it have been to believe, if you believe that someone had been raised again to mortal life? It's not much of a step further to believe that someone could have been raised to immortal life. These were Hellenized Jews among whom stories had long circulated about the immortalization and exaltation of individual figures like Romulus, Asclepius, and Heracles, as well as their own Enoch, Elijah, and Moses. Wright argues that in contrast to Enoch and others, Jesus is depicted as raised from death, resurrection, not translated while still alive. Obviously, this is because A, Jesus had actually died, no escaping that fact, and B, resurrection was not a prominent theme until later in the Second Temple period. Concerning Enoch, Elijah, and Moses, of course, Wright will say that in relation to these figures, no texts use the language of resurrection, but that is specious. The language was not used because in the minds of the authors and their communities, they had not died. For me, a key consideration is whether the relevant authors hold an anthropology that a complete human being is somehow embodied. As far as I can tell, they all do, and thus we are talking about transformed or exalted humanity, akin to what Paul perceives will happen to those who are alive at the parousia of Jesus Christ in 1 Corinthians 15. The only difference is that these patriarchs are singled out for transformation ahead of all the rest. We should also take note that none of the traditions about these figures dispenses with the body or simply talks about the ascent of the soul to heaven. So this is not as unique as Wright would have us believe. Even though Jesus' story entails resurrection, of course it did, because he had actually died. These other figures were never known or thought to have died. Concerning Greek ideas of post-mortem and post-mortal immortality, even David Litwood just excoriates Wright on this point. Over and over again, Wright avoids speaking about the corporeal implications of post-mortem transformation in Mediterranean culture, repeatedly stressing that Greeks and Romans envisioned a transformation of the soul, not the body. To make this move plausible, Wright effectively canonizes Plato, calling his writings the New Testament for the Hellenized world. As Dag Osteen Enzo points out, however, making Plato's doctrine of the immortal soul staple fare for ancient Mediterranean peoples, and in particular non-philosophers, is a distortion of the general climate of thought, especially in the 1st century CE. One has the lingering sense that Wright's account of Plato's cultural ubiquity is meant to reinforce his tendentious view that pagans emphasized only the immortality of the soul, leaving corporeal immortalization or resurrection of the body to Jews and Christians. Recent scholarship, in particular the work of Enzo, has overturned this outdated notion. Wright's highly apologetic attempt to establish the uniqueness of Jesus' resurrection fails because of a superficial comparison. Jesus' resurrection much more resembles the stories of deified men immortalized after their deaths. These men are not just immortalized in their souls, but in their bodies as well, contra Wright. Examples, Asclepius appears in full bodily presence to both Greeks and barbarians per Celsus, not as a mere phantom. Romulus appears in shining armor greater than human per Ovid, and Heracles' weight is felt in the heavens where he marries and procreates. You've got to have a body to do that, even if it's a spiritual divine body like Jesus has per Paul. The resurrection of Jesus is directly tied into and associated with the general resurrection of the dead, as he was the first fruits of all those to be raised, per 1 Corinthians, which was expected imminently. As Guy of Hermes put it, Jesus' resurrection is treated as the anticipation and cause of the reawakening of the dead at the end of time. So it's directly tied into, associated with the general resurrection of the dead still. This represents an unsurprising innovation on the Jewish theme of resurrection from the dead, wherein a single individual inaugurates the process. Such innovation is to be expected within religious movements, especially given changes in historical, cultural, and sociological factors. Innovation, therefore, does not require a miraculous explanation or occurrence. The resurrection of Jesus fits the mold of translated and exalted figures before him, including, as we mentioned, Enoch, Elijah, Romulus, Asclepius, and Heracles, whether such figures were said to have died or not. And note, Asclepius and Heracles did. The historical fact of Jesus' death was simply unavoidable, requiring resurrection in order to reverse his death and proclaim him alive. All such figures underwent corporeal immortalization. Like Jesus, they were exalted and transformed immortal divine bodies. Highly suggesting reading Litwa's Jesus Dios, pages 141 to 179, that whole chapter where he just takes this apart and absolutely deconstructs it. Then we get to Occam's razor, wielding Occam's razor. Apologists assert that the argument to the best explanation involving the least ad hoc assumptions is the mere fact of Jesus' resurrection from the dead. That's what best fits the data. Settling for the simplest explanation risks arriving at dubious and oversimplified explanations. We could just as well argue that the simplest explanation for multiple accounts of the appearances of those such as Romulus, Asclepius, or Moroni is that they really had manifested themselves to others. You wouldn't argue that for them. Why would you do it for Jesus? Explanations must be not only parsimonious, but sufficiently compelling and well evidenced, with proper correspondence to background knowledge. They should be plausible. Naturalistic explanations for the emergence of belief in Jesus' resurrection are not far-fetched or convoluted. Cognitive dissonance reduction, for example, is a common phenomenon in zealous religious movements. The unexpected and tragic death of a messianic hopeful like Jesus, resulting in proclamations that he lived again in heaven at the right hand of God and would soon return, is easily explainable as cognitive dissonance reduction in the face of crisis, especially since a host of scriptural, mythical, and cultural antecedents laid the foundation for just such a rationalization. The 1 Corinthians 15 Creed tells us explicitly that Christ was raised according to the scriptures. This is a simple and direct clue for unveiling the provenance of early resurrection belief. The expressions of death and redemption or exaltation supplied by Isaiah, Hosea, the Psalms, and elsewhere. Check out Lloyd Gearing, Resurrection as an Idiom for Exaltation, in his online book, Resurrection, a Symbol of Hope. Again, you can find this online. If you Google it, it's a great read and very meticulously, cogently explains how Jesus' resurrection is something right out of the Hebrew Scriptures. So, time for a recap. Strong evidence. Remember, I said extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, or at least compelling evidence, or sufficient evidence. Does this get us there? There is no direct or reliable evidence that the earliest followers of Jesus were made to recant their faith on pain of death. And even if they were, fanatics and zealous religious and political movements have willingly died for demonstrably false beliefs, even when they were in a position to know better. On our earliest sources, we cannot know whether Jesus was buried in the tomb or a cist grave. Exhuming the body of Jesus would have proven pointless, as it would have decomposed by the time the resurrection was being preached. The empty tomb narrative smacks of the widespread missing body motif of ancient apotheosis legends. Myths and legends arise rapidly within zealous religious movements, and early Christians were primed for resurrection exaltation belief. Hostile witnesses against such events often have no impact whatsoever. They are no match for the sheer will to believe. Appearances of the risen Jesus are sparsely evidenced. Post-mortal and post-mortem appearances were common coin in the ancient world, and we have far better evidence for the appearances of the angel Moroni, which still strains credulity. The Gospels are not eyewitness accounts. They are third-person prose narratives written by educated Greco-Roman elites. Though they lay claim to eyewitness lineage in a few brief places, this too was common coin in ancient storytelling, even fictional accounts. The women on scene at the empty tomb is precisely what we would expect from a narrator, given their prominent role in burial and mourning procedures. The Gospels are not Palestinian legal documents. So this is the final portion of the presentation, discussing the resurrection hypothesis. What is the resurrection hypothesis? Quote from William Lane Craig in his debate with Bart Ehrman. Dr. Ehrman just assumes that the probability of the resurrection on our background knowledge is very low. But here I think he's confused. What, after all, is the resurrection hypothesis? It's the hypothesis that Jesus rose supernaturally from the dead. It is not the hypothesis that Jesus rose naturally from the dead. That Jesus rose naturally from the dead is fantastically improbable. But I see no reason whatsoever to think that it is improbable that God raised Jesus from the dead. In order to show that that hypothesis is improbable, you'd have to show that God's existence is improbable. Well, Dr. Craig, challenge accepted. Because we don't have to show that any God's existence is improbable, just yours, the biblical God. Craig is partially correct. The resurrection per New Testament theology is not a matter of Jesus having naturally arisen from the dead. It is the claim that God raised Jesus from the dead. This God is none other than Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as the New Testament affirms. This presents an insurmountable problem for the resurrection hypothesis. The biblical Yahweh, the only God associated with the resurrection of Jesus, is extraordinarily unlikely to exist. Quote, the biblical God is a character in Hebrew narrative, and therefore is, in a very real sense, a figure of fiction. That's from Robert Carroll, professor of Hebrew Bible and Semitic studies. Someone who knows what he's talking about. The biblical Yahweh appears to be an entirely fictional construct, a Canaanite storm god analogous to Baal, who likewise belonged to a pantheon of mythic deities as the son of the high god El, and likewise battled with mythological creatures like Leviathan and Yam. Yahweh, like Baal, is depicted as a storm deity, has thunder as his voice, hurls the lightning like a spear or shoots it like an arrow, is designated as a rider of the clouds, just like Baal, is depicted as a son of El, especially in Deuteronomy 32, defeated the serpent Leviathan, or the Ugaritan Lotan, and had a conflict with Yam, the sea. This comes from Jacko Garrick's Does Yahweh Exist? A Critique of Realism in Old Testament Theology. I'm only giving you little snippets of his work. You've got to check it out. You can find it on academia.edu. The biblical Yahweh is depicted in explicitly anthropomorphic terms with all the apparent features of primitive human projection. Yahweh has human form. Yahweh looks like an aged man. Yahweh has eyes. Yahweh has ears. Yahweh has a mouth. Yahweh has lips. Yahweh has a tongue. Yahweh has a face. Yahweh has a backside. More than that, Yahweh has a heart. Yahweh has hands and fingers. Yahweh has arms. Yahweh has a nose with which to smell pleasant aromas, the carcasses of burning animals. Yahweh even has feet. Again, you've got to see Jacko Garrick's Does Yahweh Exist? A Critique of Realism in Old Testament Theology. Contra theologians, these are not merely metaphors for a transcendent immaterial being. The notion that the biblical God is pure spirit is something that historically arose from socio-cultural pressures and shifts in thought. This is from Francesca Stavrakopoulos' God and Anatomy. The God of modern Abrahamic religion was assembled over the course of 2,000 years from selected scraps of ancient Jewish mysticism, Greek philosophy, Christian doctrine, Protestant iconoclasm, and European colonialism. It was the cultural heft of certain forms of philosophical abstraction that altered the original view of God. The emergence of Greek versions of the Hebrew scriptures in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE had encouraged the gradual and seemingly natural metamorphosis of ancient Levantine mythology into cutting-edge Jewish metaphysics. In a Greco-Roman world in which Judaism and its subsequent Christian inflections were minority religions, some Jewish and Christian intellectuals were keen to demonstrate the erudite, sophisticated truths of their own theologies by identifying the God of their scriptures with constructs of the supreme divine in Greek philosophy. Qualities and attributes of the Jewish and Christian God were instinctively but insistently mapped onto broadly Platonic abstractions. References to God's anatomical features, such as his head, hands, and feet, became increasingly complex metaphors and multi-layered allegories. This is what the Greeks did with many of their gods, with Zeus even, is they got to a point where they said, this is too crude and we need to allegorize it. So what happened to the Jewish God Yahweh as well? No, these are not metaphors for something else. They became metaphors for historical reasons. God and Anatomy continued. The Christian construct of God as a transcendent, invisible, and incorporeal being is a distorted refraction, not a reflection, of the biblical image of God. The real God of the Bible was an ancient Levantine deity whose footsteps shook the earth, whose voice thundered through the skies. This was also a God who wept and talked and slept and sulked, a God who felt and fought and loved and lost, a God who sometimes failed and sometimes triumphed. This was a God more like the best of us and the worst of us, a God made in our own image. The biblical God was created in our image, not the other way around. He is, as Robert Carroll said, a figure of fiction. I'm not saying I know this about any gods or any kind of vague, ambiguous God concept, but about the biblical Yahweh, yes, I am. Fascinating though his history may be, a fictional character cannot do anything, much less raise someone from the dead. This is akin to saying that Marduk, Zeus, or Papa Smurf raised Jesus from the dead. The resurrection hypothesis fails because it requires the action of a wholly imaginary entity, born out of ancient myth and modified by human abstraction over the centuries. The New Testament makes it abundantly clear that the risen Christ was supposed to return soon to inaugurate the kingdom of God and fulfill messianic prophecy. I've got a whole host of New Testament chapter and verse to see just how imminently this was expected. Nowhere is this more explicit than in Matthew 16:28, where Jesus said to his disciples, "Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." The risen Jesus was supposed to return within the very lifetime of his own disciples. Instead, he remains relegated to an unseen realm, like every other immortalized figure in antiquity. Romulus, Asclepius, Heracles, all the rest. That's how you make the belief unfalsifiable. The argument to the best explanation, involving the least ad hoc assumptions here, is that Jesus is nowhere to be found because he was never actually raised to begin with. And this is unsurprising given that 1, people do not rise from the dead. 2, for someone to be raised from the dead would require a miracle. And 3, the only divine entity ever proposed to perform such a miracle for Jesus, the only supernatural agent that would be motivated or expected to do so, is a fictive construct of hoary tradition and human imagination. If indeed there was a historical Jesus, but no true Yahweh to raise him, then Jesus is dead. I end with a eulogy. This is from Joseph McCabe, his 1926 publication, The Myth of the Resurrection. Historically, there is only the slenderest of evidence of his actual words. It is not likely that anybody kept a record. He had not the slightest idea of founding a new religion, living in history, or influencing all men. He believed that the earth would be destroyed long before they could hear of him in Rome. The Gospels are compilations of Jewish and pagan moral sentiments of the time, harmonizing with the Essenian elements of the ideas of Jesus. Goodbye, pale Galilean. It was not your fault that priests made a normal rule of life of the emergency counsels of austerity, which you gave in the belief that the end of the world was nigh. You're not responsible for the Middle Ages. They used you. It seems that according to your poor light, you played a man's part. You denounced priests and priestcraft, and you told men to love one another. You were faithful to the end, by all accounts. You died for what you thought to be truth and the welfare of men. We think differently. Life is good and glorious. Love is the very flower of its sap. But we feel nearer to you than to the priests who affect to speak in your name. Goodbye, dear Galilean. Say fini. That is the end of the presentation. Thank you for joining.
Oh, snap. I got goosebumps. From that. Derek, that was really good, bro. That was really good. So you did not let my expectations down at all. Really impressed. As always, you bring high calibers. So thank you, man. Really appreciate that. And I hope everybody in the chat appreciated it as well.